Hey, thank you for joining me in the last part of this process. We stopped with having a very initial kind of wash for every area of the painting. We got the left side of that bottom shoe, pretty much just an initial glaze. We got the background, and we got this shoe that we've done pretty much in one go, especially the top part, the cloth, with all of the nuances in the light and shadow. What we're going to do next is take this from this stage onto something that is fully finalized. And that has to do with one word, and that is details. Now, the details may come in the form of what I'm doing right now, which is I need to darken some spots a little more, some larger areas. They also may come in the form of actual details, like the lettering on the tag at the back, like all sorts of small nuances and small sections, or they may come in the form of really darkening a pretty large areas and rendering the shapes within them, like you're going to see in just a few moments with the left shoe. Okay, but for now, try and see the overarching philosophy of what I do. I'm just choosing a section, I'm focusing on that, and I'm starting to render it. So one of the first things that will really bring this to life is that beautiful texture on the bottom of the shoe, and I'm really putting a lot of effort into painting it in. Just a lot of small triangles that really will show that zigzaggy shape of the front of the shoe. Now, here is where, even though we're working fairly realistically here, and you usually don't see me work this small and this, detailed, because I am aiming for some level of realism here, I'm still keeping this as a painting. It's still important for me for this to be a painting, so I'm still thinking about the overall composition. And one thing that I know for sure is I'm not going to render each and every single detail. So even in the context of these small triangles, you'll see me showing some of them clearly, but then you'll see me greatly simplifying the rest. And you'll notice how if you just put in a few of these in the places where they're meant to be, the rest will read very well by the viewer. You don't actually have to draw each and every, just like you don't have to draw every strand of hair, or paint rather. You don't have to paint every small detail of a texture, as we mentioned. I'm not gonna paint the actual dots on the cloth texture. I'm gonna create the overall shape. So just like that, here as well, you don't actually need to show each and every triangle. And I know it looks like I'm about to, but trust me, I'm not. Okay. Now I'm using a slightly dark value as I get to the front. I think this shadow gets a little stronger there. The reason for that is I think that's where the light source is, and very often closer to the light source means a stronger, darker shadow, sharper shadow too. So just know that's the reason for that. Now I'm continuing this pattern, but look at how I'm kind of working a little faster for this section, because I know it already reads well by the viewer. I take a few steps back, I look at it from afar, obviously, and these are things you don't see in this process, but I do them. And I see, okay, this really reads well as the shape of this plasticky part. I'm sure it's not really plastic, but something like that. So I can kind of put in the rest very simply. And look at under the triangles. Right now they look very like they stand out, but once I put in that shadow under them, they're really going to fall in the right context. Once I put in those diagonal lines above them too, things are just going to look in the right place. Again, remember, the painting is going through this stage of it being slowly rendered. I'm adding this smaller details up front, then I'm working on the larger areas in a different spot, and the more you add those details in, the more it will connect. If you want to achieve a realistic result, you have to do this. What I'm doing right now, to some extent, you have to slow down, look at a certain spot, really put a lot of care and work into it, and make sure things look good. There's just no way around it, okay? But you don't have to do that for the entire painting, and that's the key here. Find the right balance that works for you. For everyone, it's going to be different. I err usually on the side of more abstract, fewer details like this. But for this one, again, I want to show you that kind of a process. Now, the shadow at the bottom is going to be very important. Look at how it makes all of these highlights look much more highlighted. It just looks so much better. And a bit of another kind of dark go at it. And remember, it's going to dry a little lighter than it actually appears right now. Now, if I wanted to do this more orthodoxly, I guess the process orthodoxically, I would start with the big shape of cloth on the top of that left shoe. But sometimes you want to allow yourself to break your own patterns. If it looks like something may look fun to you, like to me, those triangles were fun. So I thought to myself, why not start with those? Sometimes something specific will attract you. Work with that. Eventually, the process has to be fun for you. Now, as I finished this right section, I realized that the left could be a little darker, and it's time to add those distinctions. You see there are lines running across it that hopefully I will put in, and they'll hopefully look good soon. This is a little too dark maybe at the top parts. I could just pour in some water into that and kind of help it move. Or I could just pick it up like I'm doing with the brush, just going over it with sort of a damp to dry brush and just picking back some of this paint to make sure it's not as dark. And as long as it works in the context of the whole painting, I don't mind if there are a little bit of cauliflowers or stuff like that. People are scared of these, and it's okay. It's natural to be scared of these, but even if you get a few backgrounds, it really won't ruin the entire painting. Now, you can't see my palette, but what I'm using now is a very thick paint, because again, I'm doing it while the paper is still wet. Look at how the paint kind of moves a bit, blends a bit, but just a bit. And that's the key, because I've been using very wet paint. Now, the shadow under the shoe felt like it needed some strengthening, so I just indicated some of it. And off we go to probably the most challenging part of this painting, which is how do I get this cloth to look natural? How do I put in all of those patterns of light and shadow and keep it looking realistic and keep it looking 3D? And it will involve one basic kind of process. Put in a value, and then either lift back the lighter parts or pour in the darker parts wet and wet. Okay, so you saw me put this small area, and now I'm doing wet and wet for some of the shadows. I'm expanding this area now with some darker paint, and to that I'll either lift or I'll either charge again darker values wet and wet. But if you really want to get things kind of in one go, you have to always look at the reference photo and see, is it getting darker, is it getting lighter? In this stage, I would honestly not worry so much about what technique you use to get it lighter or darker, but rather that you recognize the right value. So if something looks darker, you actually notice it and put a darker value. Something looks lighter, you recognize that, you put a lighter value. And all the while you're doing this, just make sure that, I don't even want to say make sure it flows together, because if some parts dry, it doesn't even matter, you know, just make sure you work in some direction. For example, I'm doing left to right. You see now I'm starting to put some wet and wets for the seams, for all the details. It's still wet. Again, the paper is still wet in that section. Where I'm working now, it's still dry. It's dry. I haven't painted yet, okay? Working around these metal details. A lot of the beauty is going to come from the strong contrast between the lights and darks there. That's a really neat effect. And I'm stopping at the shoelace because it's lighter. So that's a good stopping point for me. It means I can rest and think about the wash I'm currently working on. That's really neat. Now, the area I'm putting now has this very strong shadow cast by the shoelace. So I'm going to go back probably with dark paint and just put it there. Again, I don't care about the technique you use. If you do it wet and wet, if you do it wet on dry, just get the right value in the right place as accurately as you can. So this entire area is darker, so I'm putting in a darker value. And then once it gets lighter, I'll either use water to help move the paint around, or I'll go back to that medium value I used earlier. And they are going to blend together. Again, the way they blend together, that's technique. That's knowing water to paint ratio and how things move when they touch each other. But even if you mess it up, you can always go back and put darker paint, or you can lift, as I've shown you before. You can either lift or do wet and wet for dark. This is something you want to get a good hold of. This technique of filling in an area with maybe a mid value and then lifting and charging wet and wet. It's one thing that I think personally is probably the most important technique. Again, very often the painting will rely on multiple glazes. We've seen this before. on painting a wash that covers everything but the highlights. But when it comes to it and you actually have to render the light and shadow, it's really important to learn how to do what I'm doing right now, okay? Putting a flat wash and then charging wet and wet, or even what I'm doing right now, which is putting a dark value and then putting a lighter value next to it and really knowing what's gonna happen on an intuitive level. For example, I know that once I put a mid value next to it, they'll flow together, and then I may need to reinforce the darker areas, or if I got them dark enough from the get, I may not need to, okay? Look at this beautiful shadow within that metal ring. I don't know, is it called a ring for the laces? Well, I wonder. And here I have to reinforce that shadow. It wasn't dark enough, so I'm going revisiting it. Okay, but look at how light the light section is in this part of the cloth. I told you it moves as a general trend from left dark to right light. But there are some nuances there of the clothes folds. Okay, so there's a lot of things that are going on here, but it all comes down to this. Can you observe the accurate value, which is something, it's not easy. And I'm not saying you'll be able to do it immediately. It's something that takes practice. And can you put it in the right place? That's it. Just observe it and put it. So there's a bit of a shadow there. And then it goes to light again. So I'll just come back with some clean water and help all the paint move onto this section so that I don't get a hard edge, but also I don't go too dark. And you will see this happening now. You see water and helping the paint move towards the center. Now I'm coming back with more water and a slightly damp brush. You see how I help the paint move to the center. So I didn't go too dark because I came back with water, but I did help the paint move because I came with water onto this center of the shoe. That's really important. Now this section has to be a little darker, so I'll add some shadow to that, while still considering the fact that initially I wanted this to feel really blended and as one big shape. So I'll make sure not to lose that effect here. The way to do that is to make sure you don't get any hard edges, so you will see me blending some of them. Some hard edges are okay, they are warranted, they're actually necessary. And as the painting develops, you'll notice which ones are necessary and which ones aren't. What you see me doing now is putting in very thick paint into slightly damp paper, which is why you'll see the paint moves, but not a lot. It kind of moves, but not that much. Now, you may ask, why didn't I wait for it to dry? Because actually, I want the seams to not be super focused. I want them to be a little blended, because they're kind of an added bonus, but they're not the main detail to me. Now this part needed darkening. Again, the more you render an area, you then realize another one is now out of balance. So I go in and I darken this section a bit, especially the left section, by the way. You see how it goes a little lighter on the right and a little darker on the left. And then I'm continuing pulling this wash all the way to the bottom with water, clean water, because I don't need it to be darker, and then I'm bringing back some darker paint. This trick you'll find really useful. Put in water, and then on the edges help it connect with paint. And so you won't get a hard edge. It's kind of like doing wet and wet, really. You won't get a hard edge, and you will keep it light. See, that's how I like to do that. And if you missed what I just did, rewind it and watch it again. I basically like to, if I want to create a gradual transition from light to dark, and I want to keep it as light as it currently is, I'll just put clear water there, and then at the edges start darkening it. That's something I do very often. It's just one of those watercolor tricks you learn with time and with the years, basically, on how to render. Now it's time to look at what we've got and really think, okay, what areas still are incomplete? And there's quite a lot, believe it or not. Maybe not as much as you'd think, but there is this shadow here on the back of the sole, or on the back of where the tag is. There are big areas that still need to be slightly darkened, like the front of the shoe on the left. You'll see me kind of dragging some paint over the bottom there. There's just a lot of small touches. In theory, the painting is almost done, if you zoom out a bit, but there's no limit to just how many details you can continue adding, really. And knowing when to stop is really a personal balance. I know a lot of people struggle with that. And I mentioned before, take a break if you need to, revisit the painting with fresh eyes, and you'll know exactly what's wrong with it. One more concept I want to mention is the answer is always in front of you in the reference. So if you're unsure, it's really all about comparing it to the reference photo and really scanning and seeing what's missing. Am I missing shadows somewhere? Am I missing details? If you look at all the metal rings, you'll notice that I left them white for the most part. Some areas on them are in the shadow. So I'll need to revisit those and put in a not a strong shadow, but rather a mid to light value. All sorts of small nuances like that. The shoelace on the more right-hand shoelace, the shadow at the back could be a little darker where it curves around itself. It's all sort of small details like this that really help. Now look at the text. It's off-center. That's fine, because in the grand scheme of things, in the great context of the entire painting, it actually looks good. It actually looks very detailed too. Strengthening some shadows that weren't dark enough. Adding there's this really gentle kind of I'm not sure what it is. It's maybe like a shadow, the bounce light, I guess, on the front of the shoe that bounces off of it a bit. There's all sorts of nuances. This left section felt not dark enough, so I'm going over it with not too thick of a glaze. It may look dark, but it's actually not that dark. It's pretty wet, which is why it looks a little darker than it actually is. When you do this, just as a note on the technique, when you glaze over an area with a wetter wash, just be careful and go at it in one go. Don't scrub it too much with the brush. Don't mess with it too much, because you're always running the risk of reawakening what's underneath it. So you see, I'm just going over it once. I'm not doing too much. I'm definitely not scrubbing it. Definitely not going over the same area more than maybe once or twice. This is really important. Blending that transition, pretty much just putting a value and seeing is it dark enough. There's this nuance there where the cloth folds and is rounded onto the seam lines. That's really something that was important for me to get right. There's a much darker shadow up front there under the shoelace. Got that right, and then I'll have to blend its edge, obviously. Same for this shadow on the front, blending its edge. Just looking at it, it's very easy to fall into optical illusions and either not see what's wrong, or seeing the wrong things as wrong and the right things as right. Values are very tricky. It's something I plan on addressing in a future course, like very much in depth. So stay tuned for that for sure. It just warrants a complete course on the technique, the method, everything. Everything has to be discussed about it. But yeah, just smaller areas where I missed, some shadows, some mid values. This shoelace, honestly, or maybe it's the lip of the shoe, it just felt too dark, so I kind of go too light. Sorry, so I go and darken it a bit. It's a part of the painting that I got kind of. I told you I painted over it with the background. But it still looks good in the grand scheme of things, so nothing ruined. Here I told you I'll need to darken some of the front of the shoe, because if you look at it, it's not white there. It's not paper white. So darkening it a bit, blending those transitions onto the existing shadow, just making sure that it doesn't pop out too much, but I keep the front light, because the front is lighter. It is lighter than the background. It is the lightest part of the shoe, probably, maybe excluding the metal pieces. So yeah, you want to make sure that you preserve that. And yeah, this is really, really close to finish. It's just finishing touches there. It's just small details, small nuances of the form. If you look at the cloth, it still should be a little darker there. Or maybe I went too light on the white part, too dark on the white part. But just sharing with you, these are all things that you see how messy it is. It's just looking at an area, thinking about it and reconsidering it. And there's the shadow under the rings that I barely put in. Hopefully I'll put that later on. But this is in a way, the longest stage of the painting, and not necessarily like the most insignificant in a way, because if you think about it, all of these small touches, yes, they create a cool impression, and it's kind of like decoration. But what really gives this the realism and the good sense of volume for the shoes, makes them look three-dimensional, the thing that does that is the big shapes. And it always surprises people, but the big dark background, the big dark left side of the front shoe, the lower, like putting things in the right place, in the general right value, the big shapes, that's the key part here. All of these small metal rings and the triangles up front, which they're a little different. Even the angle of the shoe. Look at how much I made it a little flat. Well, I made it flatter at the front. All of these things don't matter. As long as you got the major shapes in the right spots, that's the thing that counts. And this goes back all the way to the drawing stage in the previous lesson, where I told you it's important to get these things in the right placement so that we have a good solid base to work from, and then we can get a few things inaccurate, we can get a few things that are kind of close to where they should be, and it doesn't matter because in the macro the shapes work. On a macro level, the values work. The big shapes is what matters, which is why I always encourage you to observe them. It's just that in this kind of a painting, a lot of the process doesn't necessarily rely on the big shapes, but rather relies on rendering small areas in detail, getting the smooth transitions that are necessary and all of that. Now I signed it and then realized I do want to add in a couple of triangles, so that happens sometimes. Even if you signed a painting, don't be hesitant to continue adding details if you see fit. It's not over till it's over. Yeah, with that, it's just pretty much done. That's it. I'm going to remove the tape, show you the final result, show you what it looks like. I think the clean border will really enhance the way it looks, especially for these kinds of paintings where you actually cover the whole thing up with paint, so there aren't any light edges really. And look at what it looks like. That's a pretty realistic painting if you look at it, especially from afar. And it's all in the placing things in the right spot, starting from big shapes to small shapes, rendering the small areas. The technique doesn't matter as much as just get the right value on the right spot. And with that, we'll wrap it up face to face. So hopefully this gives you a better idea of how you can both simplify and maintain quite a lot of the realism, and a lot of it comes down to the planning of the painting. How you set it up in the drawing stage is basically how you set it up for success in a way, because the lines you're going to put, the shapes you're going to put are already a simplification, and then you come in with the paint and the values and you simplify in that regard. You pick and choose what you want to put emphasis on. The background here is completely unimportant and irrelevant. It's just a backdrop. It's just a background, and it is a means of getting that beautiful contrast between, for example, smooth transitions and sharp transitions. So it does play a role, but not by the merit of its details. These aren't necessary. So hopefully that balance works out for you, and you understand how you can both simplify and preserve a lot of that realistic impression. I hope you enjoyed this one, and when you're ready, we can move on to the next lesson.